The air over the Primorsky Krai felt heavy, not just with the impending autumn chill, but with the suffocating reality of the Cold War. The hangar was a cavern of muted fluorescent light and the acrid, metallic smell of high-octane jet fuel. Outside, beyond the reinforced blast doors, a silent, granite-gray monster waited. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Ivanovich Belenko, 29 years old, ran a gloved hand along the sleek, deceptively simple skin of the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25 Foxbat. The aircraft was a monument to brute force engineering, a massive, twin-tailed interceptor built less out of lightweight alloys and more out of nickel steel, designed to climb fast, fly high, and deliver a payload before the West could even track it properly. It was heavy, complex, and, most importantly, secret. Belenko was one of the Soviet Union's elite. A fighter pilot with the 513th Fighter Regiment of the 11th Air Defense Army, he was entrusted with the crown jewel of Soviet aviation technology. His life was defined by strict regulations, constant surveillance, and the unwavering belief that he was part of the shield protecting the motherland. Yet, tonight, that belief felt like a lead weight pressing down on his chest. He paused near the massive air intake, his reflection a slightly distorted figure in the polished metal. His G-suit felt tight, his helmet a cold shell waiting to seal him off from the world. He wasn't thinking about his planned intercept training mission, the mock battle against a Tu-95 bomber over the Sea of Japan. He was thinking about the endless propaganda, the shoddy, cramped apartment he shared with his family, the political officers who scrutinized his every word, and the stifling lack of personal freedom. He was thinking about how a life dedicated to the glory of the Soviet Union had become a life of slow, quiet suffocation. The official story of the MiG-25 was an aerospace myth designed for intimidation. Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA and the USAF, wildly overestimated its capabilities, fearing it was an agile, all-titanium dogfighter that could outrun and outclimb anything they possessed. They called it the Foxbat, a moniker that suggested a mysterious, night-hunting predator. The truth, known only to pilots like Belenko, was more complicated. It was a beast designed for one thing: speed and altitude. Its sophisticated Smerch-A tornado radar system, capable of tracking targets hundreds of kilometers away, was powered by vacuum tubes, old technology, yet incredibly potent and resilient to enemy jamming. This radar, in particular, was the heart of the secret the West desperately craved. "Lieutenant, the weather window is closing," a sharp voice cut through the hangar's buzz. It was Major Zotov, his political commissar, a man whose eyes never seemed to blink. Zotov wasn't a pilot, but he was the real authority. "Ready, Major," Belenko replied, his voice flat. He gave Zotov a crisp salute, a movement that felt utterly meaningless. Zotov nodded curtly, his expression a perpetual mask of suspicion, and stepped back toward the hangar's main office, no doubt to log Belenko's mission details and verify the security protocols. Belenko climbed the steel ladder, settling into the cockpit's thick, worn seat. He flipped a series of heavy-duty switches, and the instrument panel flickered to life, bathing his face in a cool, green glow. The scent of ozone and warm electronics filled the air. This was his sanctuary, the one place where he held undisputed command over one of the most powerful machines on Earth. He cycled the controls. The heavy control stick moved with satisfying resistance, the rudder pedals were solid under his flight boots. He looked out at the vast expanse of the Soviet airfield, the distant line of pine trees bordering the base. This landscape had been his whole world. Today, he intended to leave it behind forever. The plan, formed in the lonely hours after agonizing shifts and fueled by smuggled copies of Western magazines, was absurd, almost suicidal. To fly an air defense interceptor, a plane designed to operate under strict ground control, across one of the most heavily monitored borders in the world, and land it in a non-military, civilian airport. Not just land it, but deliver it, the single most valuable piece of Soviet military hardware, directly into the hands of the enemy. The initial target was Hakodate Airport in Hokkaido, Japan. It was far, well beyond the Foxbat's optimal operational range, forcing him to push the temperamental Tamansky R-15B-30 engines to their absolute limit. He would have to fly low, hugging the terrain once over the sea, to avoid Soviet air defenses, then climb high to conserve fuel before the final, treacherous descent. Belenko reached down and tapped the side of the map case strapped to his thigh. Inside, a crudely drawn flight path was marked, a path that was already a violation of every regulation he had sworn to uphold. The KGB agents stationed at the base would laugh at the very notion of this crazy plan, believing their security network was impenetrable. They believed their control over his mind was absolute. They were wrong. A voice crackled in his headset, the Ground Control Intercept, GCI, officer. Foxbat Leader 48, clear for taxi. Proceed to runway 09. 48, taxiing to 09, Belenko confirmed, his voice calm, betraying none of the internal hurricane of fear and resolve. He released the brakes. The jet's forward momentum began with a low, hydraulic groan. He was moving now. There was no going back. As the heavy Foxbat rolled onto the tarmac, he imagined the look on Major Zotov's face when the inevitable alarm was raised. That thought, more than anything, fortified his resolve. He was trading everything, his country, his career, possibly his life, for freedom. The massive MiG-25P lumbered onto the main runway, the twin Tumansky engines idling with a deep, hungry rumble. Belenko completed his pre-flight checklist with the automatic precision of thousands of hours in the cockpit, flight surfaces checked, hydraulics green, fuel crossfeeds open. He took a final, deep breath. The smell of kerosene was sharp and familiar. In the control tower, the Ground Control Intercept, GCI, officer, a young captain named Vasilyev, watched the blip of Foxbat 48 move into position. This was a standard training mission, a familiar drill. Belenko was scheduled to fly an interception profile against a Soviet Tu-95 Bear bomber simulate an enemy intrusion over the Sea of Japan, a routine exercise in maintaining the Soviet Far East's air defense readiness. The plan called for an initial high-altitude climb, an intercept simulation, and then a return to base. Predictable, safe, and entirely monitored. Belenko pushed the throttles forward. The Foxbat shuddered, then surged. The sound was deafening, a roaring testament to raw power. He released the brakes. The massive jet hurtled down the runway, its two engines spitting orange flame and leaving a heat shimmer in its wake. The acceleration was punishing, pinning Belenko against his seat. The speed tape blurred, and at the designated mark, he pulled back firmly on the stick. The Foxbat clawed its way into the darkening sky, its massive wings generating the lift needed for its considerable weight. The ground fell away instantly. Retracting the landing gear with a heavy thump, Belenko immediately focused on the crucial first phase of his escape, establishing the deception. 48 airborne. Executing initial climb profile, he reported to Captain Vasilyev, his voice clipped and professional. Roger, 48. Maintain assigned vector, climbing to 20,000 meters. Report successful altitude stabilization, Vasilyev responded. The target altitude was approximately 65,000 feet, where the air was thin and the Foxbat performed best as a high-speed interceptor. For the next 10 minutes, Belenko flew the mission as briefed. He climbed rapidly, punching through the lower atmosphere, the sky outside turning from bruised purple to the deep, silent indigo of near space. The MiG-25 was an absolute rocket, it devoured altitude with ease. This initial trajectory, due east toward the training zone over the Sea of Japan, was perfectly normal. His plan relied entirely on this period of normal flight to lull both the GCI controllers and the orbiting radar picket ships into a false sense of security. As he reached his initial cruising altitude, the curvature of the Earth became apparent outside his canopy. The horizon was a sharp line of blue and black. He reported in, GCI, 48 stabilized at 20,000. Commencing sweep for Tu-95 target. Vasilyev acknowledged and gave him the mock target coordinates. Belenko engaged his powerful Smerch A radar, its vacuum tubes humming to life, sweeping the empty air where the Bear bomber was supposed to be. But his actual focus was on a tiny, secondary display screen, a rudimentary TACAN, tactical air navigation, system that, by luck, was still operational on this particular airframe. He had programmed it earlier with the coordinates of his first major waypoint, a small, uninhabited island south of the main Soviet coastline, marking the point of no return. He flew for 5 more minutes, perfectly maintaining the illusion of the training mission. He ran a diagnostic check, reported a minor fictitious radar anomaly to GCI, and then made his move. GCI, 48 reports radar failure in the primary targeting mode. Requiring immediate descent to attempt a lower altitude fix. Permission to drop to 5,000 meters. Belenko requested, his voice laced with the slight urgency appropriate for a critical equipment malfunction. A primary radar failure on the Foxbat was a serious issue, necessitating a prompt change in profile. It was also an entirely believable technical glitch in Soviet aircraft. Vasilyev hesitated for only a second, a procedural pause, before responding. Negative, 48. Maintain your altitude. We are contacting maintenance now for diagnostics, Vasilyev ordered. Belenko knew this was his critical moment. Waiting for GCI to coordinate with maintenance would allow Major Zotov and the inevitable KGB watchdogs to be alerted. He had to execute his plan now, before suspicion could turn into alarm. Negative received, GCI. The system is degrading rapidly. I am commencing emergency descent to 5,000 meters to run local diagnostics. I will maintain radio silence until I have a fix, Belenko stated, his tone firm, leaving no room for negotiation. This was a pilot taking decisive action in an emergency, a highly trained professional prioritizing the preservation of his aircraft. It was an excuse that bought him precious minutes. He shoved the stick forward. The MiG-25 nose dropped, the airspeed indicator immediately spiraled upward, and the great jet began a steep, controlled dive. The GCI alarm system in the tower likely flashed red. Vasilyev would be shouting into his microphone now, but it was too late. Belenko snapped the radio to the emergency frequency, then immediately to silence, disconnecting from the Soviet command structure entirely. He was alone, now a rogue blip plunging toward the waves. The descent was brutal, designed to get him below the main Soviet radar coverage as quickly as possible. The air thickened, buffeting the airframe. As the altimeter spun past 6,000 meters, he leveled off, fighting the enormous momentum. Now, he was hugging the waves, maybe 150 meters above the choppy surface of the Sea of Japan. He changed his vector sharply, no longer flying due east, but turning south-southeast, a perfect right angle to his assigned path. He was heading for the international waters between the Soviet Far East and the Japanese coastline. He was no longer Lieutenant Viktor Belenko on a training mission. He was a defector, flying the most classified aircraft in the world toward the light of the free world. The vast, empty ocean stretched out before him, and behind him, the silent, invisible hounds of the Soviet military machine were already beginning their frantic chase. The sudden, radical change in altitude and heading instantly transformed the MiG-25P from a friendly Soviet asset into an unidentified, hostile penetration. Below 150 meters, the massive jet became effectively invisible to the distant, shore-based Soviet Ground Control Intercept, GCI, radars. The curvature of the earth and the ground clutter of the sea surface shielded him completely. In the Chugyevka control tower, Captain Vasilyev was already in a state of controlled panic. The sudden disappearance of Foxbat 48 from the altitude indicator after its unauthorized descent was not just a procedural violation, it was a crisis. He repeatedly keyed his microphone, shouting into the static silence, 48, this is GCI. Respond immediately. Report status. Silence. Only the hiss of the cold channel answered him. The senior officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Markov, a veteran with a face carved by suspicion and late nights, stormed over to the console. His eyes were wide with immediate dread. Where is he, Vasilyev? Sir, he reported a smirch failure and claimed an emergency descent to 5,000 meters, then silenced his radio. We lost him at 150 meters, south-southeast vector. He broke assigned flight path immediately. Markov didn't need the KGB's mandatory weekly paranoia briefings to understand the implications. An unauthorized turn toward the sea, radio silence, and a complete descent below radar visibility. This was not a systems failure. This was defection. And the aircraft involved was the MiG-25. Sound the general alarm. Markov roared, his voice cracking. Contact the 11th Air Defense HQ. Scramble interceptors from Vladivostok. He's heading for Japan. Call the PVO, Air Defense Forces, naval patrols immediately. Every available eye on the water. Within minutes, the Soviet Far East Air Defense Command was paralyzed by a shockwave of bureaucratic and military terror. The nightmare scenario, the loss of a top-tier aircraft and, critically, the technological secrets it held, was unfolding in real time. Losing any jet was bad, losing the Foxbat was an international catastrophe. Meanwhile, 150 meters above the icy chop of the Sea of Japan, Viktor Belenko pushed the throttles forward again, settling into his fuel-critical, high-speed dash. The cockpit was a cramped bubble of focus. The Foxbat felt immense, shaking slightly as it skimmed the wave tops. At this low altitude and high speed, he was consuming fuel at a terrifying rate, burning through his precious reserves. He had to be fast, but he also had to be efficient. He was flying visually, relying on the hazy horizon and the slight distortion of the sea below. There was no margin for error. A slight overcorrection in a high-speed turn, and the heavy jet would auger straight into the cold water. The immense forces of air resistance at this density pounded the airframe, but the Foxbat, built tough and heavy, endured. Belenko kept his head on a swivel. Any moment, he expected to see the needle noses of chasing MiG-21s or Su-15s appearing above and behind him, sent from the Soviet mainland. If he was caught in Soviet airspace or even international airspace close to their territory, the orders would be simple and deadly: shoot him down. The plane and its secrets could not be allowed to leave the Soviet orbit. His mind worked through the contingencies. The MiG-25 carried 4 R-40 air-to-air missiles. He had them armed and ready, a grim paradox, a Soviet pilot ready to defend himself against his former comrades. He watched his fuel gauge, the most critical instrument in the cockpit, dropping steadily towards the quarter-tank mark. The total distance to Hakodate was approximately 700 kilometers, a harrowing stretch of ocean. He reached the approximate point where he calculated he would enter international airspace. This provided a small, psychological comfort, but no real physical safety. The Soviet search was ramping up. Back at the Vladivostok Air Base, the klaxons were screaming. Two Su-15 Flagon D interceptors were being armed and fueled, their pilots scrambling into their gear. They knew the target, Foxbat 48. The mission parameters were ambiguous: recover, or destroy if necessary. Belenko knew they were coming. The only way to survive the interception was to ensure the chasers could not lock onto him. He kept his speed high and his altitude constant, using the natural radar horizon as his shield. He was relying on the delay caused by Soviet bureaucracy and the initial confusion, the time it took Markov to convince his superiors that a defection was underway, not just a crash. He glanced at his internal clock. Only 20 minutes had passed since he disconnected from GCI, but it felt like an entire lifetime. He was now approximately 350 kilometers from the Soviet coast. He had crossed the most immediate danger zone. He allowed himself a brief, faint moment of professional pride. His calculations had been flawless. The escape profile was working. He now faced the second, even more terrifying challenge, the long, desperate flight over open water, dodging the inevitable naval and air patrols, and ensuring he had enough fuel left for the final, precise approach to a civilian airport in a foreign, bewildered country. The next hour would determine everything. The alarm at the 11th Air Defense Army headquarters in Khabarovsk reached the highest echelons of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO, with lightning speed, transforming the routine Sunday afternoon into a genuine geopolitical panic. The news was relayed to Moscow, where the reaction was one of stunned, incandescent rage. The MiG-25 Foxbat, the jewel of Soviet aviation and a symbol of technological prowess, was missing. Major General Grishin, the regional commander, slammed his fist onto the map table, scattering markers and paper. His face was a mask of cold fury, knowing that his career, and perhaps his freedom, depended on the next few hours. Next to him, a representative from the KGB's 3rd Main Directorate, responsible for military counterintelligence, stood stiffly, his silence more terrifying than any shouting. "This is not a simple navigation error, General," the KGB officer, Colonel Volkov, stated, his voice low and dangerous. "Lieutenant Belenko's file, minor ideological deviations, requesting transfer to a less isolated unit. He has defected. And he is taking the Smerche radar with him. Find him, Grishin. If you cannot recover the aircraft, you must destroy it. Do you understand? Destroy it." Volkov emphasized the word destroy. The priority was absolute. The secrets of the Foxbat's radar, engine performance, and missile guidance systems could not fall into NATO hands. The diplomatic fallout of shooting down a plane over international waters, or even Japan, was secondary to the technological loss. The chase was now fully activated. At Vladivostok Air Base, the two scrambled Su-15 Flagon D interceptors were airborne, climbing quickly, their pilots receiving vague, alarming instructions: search for a high-speed, low-flying contact identified as Target 48. Simultaneously, the vast network of Soviet naval intelligence and patrol ships in the Sea of Japan was mobilized. Destroyers and Krivak-class frigates were instructed to activate every radar system they possessed, searching for a rogue contact cutting south. The problem was the sheer scale of the sea and Belenko's brilliant, if reckless, decision to fly at treetop level. The Foxbat, built largely of nickel-steel alloy to handle the heat of Mach 3 flight, had a massive radar cross-section, RCS. Normally, this made it a bright target. But the low altitude utilized a phenomenon known as radar ducting and sea clutter. The radar horizon for a ship's antenna, even a large warship, is only about 40 to 50 kilometers. Belenko was flying below that horizon, hidden in the chaotic reflections of the churning waves. The chasing Soviet aircraft had to fly low themselves to see him, putting them at risk of running into the water in the hazy twilight conditions. Back in the MiG-25P, Viktor Belenko was fighting the aircraft's thirst for fuel. He pulled the engines back slightly, feathering the throttles to achieve maximum range speed, a careful balancing act between making headway and making it all the way to Hokkaido. The noise in the cockpit was a constant, tiring roar. He ran a quick calculation on his fuel reserves. The margin was terrifyingly thin. He estimated he had enough to reach the Japanese coastline, but the margin for error was less than 5 minutes of full throttle. Any detour, any engagement, any requirement to climb would mean ditching the aircraft in the water. Then, the radar warning receiver chirped. Not a sustained tone, but a single, sharp blip. A radar sweep, distant and likely ship-based, had skimmed the top of his canopy before dipping back down into the waves. He knew what this meant. He had been momentarily detected, and the Soviets were closing the net. Belenko immediately executed a sharp, shallow turn to the east, altering his heading by 5 degrees. This simple maneuver was designed to break the tracking sequence and confuse the search algorithm of the distant Soviet ship. He didn't climb, climbing would expose him fully. He just shifted his horizontal position, increasing the distance and complexity for anyone attempting to plot his course. The silence that followed the single blip was deafening. Had it worked? Was it a single ship? Were the interceptors close? He felt the heavy presence of the chase pressing down on him. The air seemed to grow colder, even inside his heated cockpit. He focused on his secondary navigation system. The TACAN reading for the Japanese coast was slowly, agonizingly coming into range. He was relying on the system to pick up the radio beacons from the Japanese islands, something he had studied extensively in secret during his planning phase. He needed a clear signal. The thought of his family, his wife and young son, flashed through his mind, a sharp, momentary pang of guilt and sacrifice. He pushed it away. He had made his choice. This desperate flight was not just about the plane, it was about the fundamental choice between the stifling uniformity of the Soviet regime and the distant, unknown prospect of freedom. He peered ahead through the canopy. The sea was beginning to look different, the color was changing, the waves perhaps smaller, indicative of approaching landmasses. He was closing on the Tsugaru Strait, the narrow, highly sensitive international waterway separating Honshu and Hokkaido, Japan's main islands. He had survived the most dangerous phase of the chase. Now came the delicate act of penetrating non-hostile airspace and ensuring a safe, recognized landing. The fate of the most advanced Soviet jet, and the future of the Cold War technology race, hung in the balance. The transition from the vast, hostile emptiness of the Sea of Japan to the crowded, complex environment of the Japanese Air Defense Identification Zone, JADIZ, was immediate and jarring. The instruments in the MiG-25's cockpit, designed for tracking enemy bombers in near space, now had to guide Belenko through a maze of civilian air traffic and sophisticated Western radar systems. He finally caught a consistent signal on his auxiliary navigation gear, a radio beacon from Hokkaido. This was it. He had successfully navigated across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean entirely under the radar horizon, a feat of low-level, high-speed flight that would have been impossible in most other large interceptors. However, remaining low was no longer an option. He was critically low on fuel. The powerful Tumansky R-15B-30 engines, designed for high-altitude sprints, were thirsty beasts, and they had been gulping fuel to maintain his speed and evade the Soviet dragnet. To make it the final distance and execute a landing approach, he had to climb to a more fuel-efficient altitude and reduce his speed. This meant exposing himself to the Japanese and U.S. radar picket stations, which constantly monitored the sensitive strait. Belenko pushed the stick forward and gently increased the angle of attack. The Foxbat began its slow ascent from the wave tops, a silent, metallic shark emerging from the depths. 6:15 a.m. local time. Ground Self-Defense Force Radar Station, Wakanai, Hokkaido. In the brightly lit, air-conditioned room, a Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, JASDF, radar operator, Sergeant Kenjiro Sato, noticed a new, large, and completely unidentifiable contact suddenly bloom on his main screen. It was moving fast, climbing rapidly, and heading directly for Hokkaido's western coastline. Contact! Sato called out, his voice tense but controlled. Heavy, high-speed target, Vector 160, altitude 3,000 meters and climbing. No transponder signal. Origin appears to be the Sea of Japan. The senior officer, Major Takahashi, immediately leaned over the console. A high-speed contact without an IFF, identification friend or foe, transponder signal originating from that direction could only mean one thing, a Soviet intrusion. But this was unlike the standard Tu-95 Bear or reconnaissance aircraft they usually intercepted. This contact was exceptionally fast and very large. Scramble alerts, immediately. This is an unknown intruder, Takahashi ordered. He notified the nearby JSDF Chitose Air Base. Standard procedure was to dispatch F-4EJ Phantom II interceptors to investigate and visually identify the contact. Belenko knew this was happening. His radar warning receiver had lit up like a Christmas tree, indicating multiple radar sweeps, Japanese and American, were now painting his aircraft. He was no longer a ghost, he was a glaring, tactical problem for three different powers. He had rehearsed his approach strategy thousands of times in his mind. He needed to make an unambiguous, non-hostile signal. He was not there to fight or provoke, he was delivering a gift. As he reached his desired cruising altitude of 5,000 meters and slowed to a more manageable speed, Belenko reached for his radio. He selected the International Emergency Distress Frequency, the one channel guaranteed to be monitored by every nation's air traffic control. He flipped the transmit switch. His voice, strained but steady, cut through the static, speaking in heavily accented but clear English, the global language of aviation. This is Soviet military aircraft Foxbat 48. I am requesting immediate landing clearance. I am a defector. I have an emergency fuel situation. Destination is Hakodate Airport. The transmission was short, direct, and devastating. Back in the JASDF command centers and on U.S. listening ships, chaos erupted. The word Foxbat sent a shockwave. The Foxbat was the phantom of the Cold War, the plane the West had spent a decade trying to understand. And now, its pilot was requesting a landing? The Japanese scrambled order was immediately complicated. They had to intercept, but now they knew the pilot's intent. Shooting down a defector requesting asylum with an emergency situation would be an international incident of unprecedented scale. The rules of engagement shifted from interception to escort. Meanwhile, Belenko peered down, spotting the coastline of Hokkaido, a jagged line of civilization and light. He was close. But his fuel gauge needle was hovering precariously over the red line. He was running on fumes. He had to descend now and find the runway. He was over Hakodate. He spotted the city lights. But in the center of the lights, he saw nothing that looked like the sprawling military airfield he expected. Hakodate was a civilian regional airport, tiny, with a single, short runway, designed for propeller planes and regional jets. His detailed, secret maps had been misleading, they showed a far larger facility. He was faced with the realization of the final, lethal risk of his plan, landing a massive, 40,000-pound interceptor, designed for speed, onto a strip barely long enough for a Boeing 737, with almost zero fuel for a go-around. The site of Hakodate Airport, a single, relatively short ribbon of asphalt, runway 12/30, only 2,000 meters long, sent a jolt of sheer terror through Viktor Belenko. He knew instantly that his intelligence, gathered years before and based on outdated Soviet reconnaissance, was fatally flawed. The MiG-25 was an aerospace giant. Its normal landing speed was over 300 kilometers per hour. It required vast stretches of runway to bleed off speed and come to a halt. He was committed. His fuel gauges were reading dangerously close to empty, meaning the massive engines were running on vapor. He could not climb for a better view, nor could he divert to a larger military base like Chitose, which was too far away. This was his only chance. In the Hakodate control tower, the air traffic controllers, regional Japanese civilians, were in an unimaginable state of panic. They had received the international advisory, relayed through the JASDF, that a Soviet military jet was inbound, claiming defection and emergency. They watched in disbelief as the high-speed blip on their antiquated radar scopes transformed into the physical reality of a colossal, silver interceptor descending rapidly through the cloud cover. Belenko began his final approach, fighting the inherent instability of the Foxbat at low speed. The MiG-25 was engineered for supersonic speed, not slow, precise maneuvers. Its highly swept wings provided poor lift at low velocity, demanding a high-speed approach that would make stopping impossible. He lowered the flaps and landing gear. The hydraulic shudder was audible even over the roar of the engines, a massive drag pulling his speed down. The nose of the jet was pitched high to maintain the angle of attack, making it difficult for him to see the runway directly. He had to rely almost entirely on his peripheral vision and instrument panel. Hakodate Tower, this is Foxbat 48. On final approach, extreme fuel emergency. Request immediate clearance for runway 12, Belenko transmitted, his voice now ragged with exertion and adrenaline. The controller, a young man named Kenta, swallowed hard and responded in rushed, heavily accented English. Foxbat 48, you are cleared to land, runway 12. Caution, runway is short. Repeat, runway is short. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Belenko already knew the runway was short. He focused entirely on a point halfway down the asphalt strip, aiming to touch down as early as possible. He needed the first meter of tarmac. He crossed the airport boundary fence, the ground rushing up at an alarming rate. He was still too fast, well over the recommended landing speed for a jet this heavy. He cut the power to the twin Tumansky engines. The roar instantly dropped to a desperate whistling sound, the noise of air rushing over the dying engines. Touchdown. The wheels hit the asphalt with a sickening, jarring smack. The whole airframe groaned under the impact. He was down, but the real crisis was just beginning. The runway lights blurred into white streaks. Belenko immediately applied the maximum force to the wheel brakes, slamming his foot down. The anti-skid system fought a desperate battle against hydroplaning on the damp runway surface. Then, he deployed the drogue parachute. With a loud, whipping crack, the immense red and white chute blossomed behind the Foxbat, a final, desperate anchor. The deceleration was brutal. Belenko was slammed forward against his 5-point harness. The immense friction of the chute and the tortured scream of the brakes finally began to eat into the deadly speed. He was sliding past the midway point of the runway. The end of the runway, the grass, the fence, and the terminal buildings, were rushing toward him. Screeching, groaning, and metal friction. The chute ripped free. The braking power was reduced instantly. Belenko held his breath, seeing the end boundary lights flash past the canopy. The jet was still moving too fast. In a final, instinctive act, he fought the jet sideways, utilizing the rudder to steer the aircraft off the main runway. The tires left the smooth asphalt and bit into the softer, waterlogged unpaved safety overrun area. The aircraft yawed violently, slowing dramatically in the thick mud and grass. With a final, exhausting lurch, the MiG-25P ground to a halt. Silence. The cockpit was instantly quiet, save for the ticking of cooling metal and Belenko's ragged breathing. He had stopped just 100 meters short of the main terminal building, directly in front of a navigational antenna and a line of stunned civilian airliners. The plane was resting nose up in the mud, its large tires half buried in the soft earth. He had done it. He sat for a moment, letting the adrenaline subside, before reaching up and flipping the canopy release lever. The heavy canopy hissed and slid back. The cool, damp air of Hokkaido rushed into the cockpit, carrying the sound of distant sirens. As he began to unstrap, he looked down. The fuel gauge was on 0. The engines had flamed out literally seconds after he had cut the power for the landing flare. He had consumed every last drop. Belenko climbed out of the cockpit, stepping onto the wing of the aircraft that had just carried him to a new life. He stood atop the symbol of Soviet military secrecy, looked out at the flashing blue and red lights of the Japanese police and airport fire crew rushing towards him, and waited for the world to catch up to the fact that the Foxbat was now officially in the hands of the West. The arrival of the MiG-25P, a physical manifestation of the Cold War's deepest anxieties, onto the muddy safety overrun of a regional civilian airport in Japan was instantly the single most significant intelligence event of the decade. The initial responders were a confused mix of Japanese authorities. First on the scene were the Hakodate Airport Fire Brigade and local Hokkaido Prefectural Police, armed with nothing more than hoses and sidearms. They found Senior Lieutenant Viktor Belenko standing calmly on the enormous wing of his jet, dressed in a Soviet flight suit. Belenko descended the wing, landing clumsily in the soft mud. He immediately gestured to the police, making it clear he was surrendering. He removed his helmet, revealing a face streaked with sweat and exhaustion, but his eyes were clear and resolute. "I am a pilot of the Soviet Union. I request political asylum in the United States," Belenko announced in his halting English, ensuring his intention was unmistakable. The Japanese police, bewildered by the sheer size of the metallic beast and the pilot's calm demeanor, quickly cordoned off the area. They immediately realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a minor incident, it was an act of high international espionage. The MiG-25 was far too large to be moved without specialized equipment, and it sat, an uninvited titanium guest, blocking the primary runway. Hakodate Airport was effectively shut down. Within the hour, the news had traveled from the local police station to the highest levels in Tokyo. The Japanese government was thrown into diplomatic paralysis. They had a defector, a request for asylum, and the crown jewel of Soviet military aviation sitting on their tarmac. They had to handle the situation delicately to avoid provoking a direct Soviet military response while simultaneously securing the intelligence goldmine. Prime Minister Takeo Miki convened an emergency cabinet session. The decision was made quickly: the plane must be secured and examined, and the pilot interviewed by the proper authorities. The closest military installation, Chitose Air Base, was notified to send specialized security teams. Word also reached the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and, crucially, USAF and CIA liaison offices. The news of a Foxbat landing in Japan was met with a mixture of disbelief and frantic excitement. For years, the U.S. had poured billions into trying to understand the Foxbat's performance envelope and capabilities. Now, the machine was theirs. Belenko was transported under heavy police escort to a secure facility near Chitose. His initial interrogators were Japanese intelligence officers, but a contingent of highly specialized U.S. Air Force Intelligence, AFIN, and Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, personnel were already en route from U.S. bases in mainland Japan, practically flying at supersonic speeds themselves. The first interview session was less about intelligence and more about verification. They needed to establish his identity, his motives, and his willingness to cooperate. Lieutenant Belenko, a Japanese officer, began, speaking through an interpreter. "Why did you choose Japan? Why the United States?" Belenko was clear. He spoke of the stifling political atmosphere in the Soviet Union, the constant scrutiny of the KGB, the broken promises of the Soviet dream, and his professional disillusionment with the rigid command structure. He had chosen the United States for asylum because he believed only the US had the resources and the will to stand up to Soviet pressure and protect him. Critically, when asked about the aircraft, Belenko revealed the true state of the MiG-25, correcting the West's decade of false assumptions. He confirmed that its advanced features were counterbalanced by significant flaws. The engines had a very short operational life, only 150 hours between overhauls, the airframe was heavy and built primarily from steel, and it was not the nimble dogfighter the West feared. But the real prize, the Smerch-A radar system, was intact and utterly revolutionary. Belenko provided the keys to understanding the system's operational frequencies, countermeasures, and capabilities. He explained the nature of the vacuum tubes, a deliberate design choice for power output and resistance to electromagnetic pulse (EMP), and its sheer output power, confirming its ability to burn through most NATO jamming attempts. The intelligence officers realized they weren't just getting a pilot, they were getting the operational manual for the Soviet Union's most feared interceptor. The sheer volume of technical data he was able to provide from memory was staggering, confirming his elite status and deep familiarity with the aircraft's classified systems. Back in Moscow, the reaction was transforming from internal panic to coordinated international damage control. Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky in Tokyo was instructed to demand the immediate return of the stolen property and the rogue criminal pilot, claiming Belenko was suffering from a mental breakdown and had merely crashed the plane on Japanese soil. The KGB's initial laughter at the crazy plan had turned to cold, devastating fury. The diplomatic and intelligence war over the Foxbat had just begun. The sheer magnitude of the intelligence coup sent ripples of excitement and methodical planning across the Pacific, particularly within the walls of the Pentagon and CIA headquarters in Langley. The MiG-25P wasn't just a plane, it was a physical roadmap to Soviet air defense strategy, avionics, and metallurgy. While Belenko was being thoroughly debriefed at a secure location, the Japanese and American governments began the delicate, logistically nightmare process of exploiting the aircraft. The priority was the immediate, microscopic examination of the Smerch-A radar and its associated weapons control system before the inevitable Soviet recovery attempt or sabotage. A joint US-Japanese technical examination team was rapidly assembled. It consisted of aerospace engineers, radar specialists, and ordnance experts from the USAF Foreign Technology Division, FTD, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and technical staff from the Japan Self-Defense Forces. They were flown into Hokkaido under the cover of immense secrecy, using military transport planes landing at nearby Chitose Air Base. The team's first challenge was getting the colossal, mud-stuck Foxbat off the civilian airport grounds and onto a military transport capable of carrying it. Since the plane was too large to be transported whole, the decision was quickly made: the MiG-25 had to be disassembled. This process began immediately at Hakodate. Under floodlights and guarded by an impenetrable ring of Japanese police and military personnel, the American and Japanese technicians swarmed the aircraft. They used the Soviet maintenance manuals Belenko had confirmed were accurate to begin the meticulous, methodical deconstruction. Every component was catalogued, photographed, and carefully removed. The Smerch-A radar array, located in the massive nose cone, was the first item to be secured. It was gently unbolted, carefully crated, and immediately airlifted to Misawa Air Base for preliminary examination before its final journey to the FTD's Primary Analysis Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. The revelation that the high-powered system was driven by vacuum tube technology provided immediate insight. While appearing outdated, the tubes were highly resistant to jamming and EMP, revealing a pragmatic, rugged design philosophy the West hadn't fully appreciated. Next came the engines. The twin Tumansky R-15B-30 turbojets were removed. Their inspection revealed their incredibly short service life, confirming Belenko's debriefing and debunking the pervasive Western myth that the MiG-25 could fly repeatedly at Mach 3.0. The metallurgy was largely steel alloy, not the suspected titanium, again showing the Soviets prioritized speed and altitude over maneuverability and endurance. The Americans realized their initial intelligence estimates had been significantly inflated, meaning the Soviet technological lead in certain areas was not as great as feared. The cockpit was also minutely examined. The flight instruments, radio equipment, and especially the IFF, identification friend or foe, transponder were analyzed. Belenko's account of his mission profile was validated by the settings found on his navigation equipment, proving his defection was meticulously planned. This intense, 24-hour-a-day dissection of the aircraft provided the West with three major categories of immediate, actionable intelligence: radar and fire control, full operational details of the Smerch-A and the R-40 missile guidance system, allowing NATO to develop new electronic countermeasures, ECM, specific to these frequencies and algorithms. Performance envelope, accurate data on the Foxbat's true speed, climb rate, and range limitations, drastically lowering the perceived threat level in certain scenarios. Soviet design philosophy, insight into Soviet materials, manufacturing, and maintenance standards, confirming vulnerabilities in their high-tech programs. The operation was conducted under extreme pressure. Soviet diplomatic demands for the plane's return were becoming increasingly shrill, dominating international news headlines. The Soviets were monitoring every Japanese and American movement, publicly accusing Japan of theft and violation of international law. The clock was ticking before the diplomatic crisis forced the return of the dismantled wreckage. The Japanese government, eager to placate Moscow while still cooperating with Washington, began planning the final act, packaging the now thoroughly documented and dismantled jet and returning it as damaged property, but only after the intelligence harvest was complete. The sheer audacity of Belenko's flight had paid off in a currency more valuable than gold: technological superiority. The secrets of the Foxbat were now irrevocably compromised. In the Soviet Union, the Belenko defection and the loss of the MiG-25P created a political and military firestorm that reached the very top of the Politburo. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev reportedly viewed the incident as a deeply personal betrayal and a profound national humiliation. The KGB and the PVO, Air Defense Forces, were immediately locked in a vicious blame game, each pointing fingers at the other for the catastrophic security failure. The immediate Soviet reaction was a calculated blend of denial, outrage, and aggressive diplomacy. Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky in Tokyo was placed under immense pressure to execute the Kremlin's strategy. He publicly labeled Viktor Belenko a traitor and a criminal who had stolen state property while suffering from a psychological breakdown. The official Soviet line was that Belenko had merely been on a routine training flight, experienced an emergency, and crashed in Japan. Therefore, the aircraft and the pilot must be immediately returned according to international agreements. They vehemently denied Belenko's defection claim, branding it a lie orchestrated by the CIA. The diplomatic notes escalated from demands to thinly veiled threats, accusing Japan of violating state sovereignty and conspiring in an act of espionage. The Soviet media, controlled entirely by the state, ran propaganda pieces painting Belenko as a pathetic figure, either a madman or a desperate embezzler fleeing justice, certainly not a man motivated by ideology or a genuine desire for freedom. They ridiculed the idea that any Soviet officer would willingly abandon the workers' paradise for the decadence of the West. However, behind the curtain of state-sponsored outrage, a cold, military reality set in. The senior leadership realized that the entire MiG-25 fleet, which represented the pinnacle of their air defense capability, was now technologically compromised. The West knew the operational frequencies of the Smerch-A radar and the flight parameters of the R-40 missiles. This forced an immediate, expensive, and massive modernization program. Within weeks of Belenko's landing, Moscow made a unilateral decision: the entire MiG-25 fleet had to be refitted. This involved replacing the radar, the installation of an entirely new, heavily modified radar system, the N005 Smerch-A2, designed to operate on new, secret frequencies and incorporating countermeasures against the Western knowledge derived from the original Smerch-A. Updating the IFF transponders, replacing the entire IFF system with new, encrypted codes and protocols to prevent any future use of Belenko's intelligence. Modernizing missiles, urgent re-engineering of the R-40 air-to-air missile guidance packages. This enormous, fleet-wide undertaking cost the Soviet state hundreds of millions of rubles and took years to complete, effectively hobbling the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO, in the interim. The ultimate cost of Belenko's defection was not just the single aircraft, but the forced obsolescence of an entire critical air defense structure. Meanwhile, the Japanese government was walking a diplomatic tightrope. They granted Belenko temporary political asylum, securing his safety from Soviet agents, and then arranged for his rapid transfer to the United States. They knew holding him would only prolong the crisis. On September 9, just 4 days after landing, Viktor Belenko was quietly flown out of Japan on a commercial flight to an undisclosed location in the U.S. The fate of the plane itself remained the central point of contention. Polyansky continuously demanded unconditional return. However, Japan was deliberately dragging its heels, allowing the U.S. technicians every possible moment to complete their examination. The Japanese government maintained that the plane was under investigation as evidence in an illegal entry case. This period of intense scrutiny and delay was crucial. The full deconstruction, inspection, testing, and photographing of the Foxbat's components took approximately 45 days. By the time the Japanese authorities were finally ready to concede, the plane was nothing more than hundreds of crates containing analyzed, labeled, and crated components. The Soviet Union eventually agreed to accept the dismantled remains of the Foxbat, provided they were returned aboard a Soviet transport ship, reflecting their deep distrust of any non-Soviet handling. The irony was palpable. The Soviets would be paying the bill for shipping their own most secret technology back, but only after the West had extracted every single secret. The Belenko incident had irrevocably shattered the mystique of the MiG-25. The once feared superplane was now exposed for its strengths and, more importantly, its weaknesses. The psychological edge the Soviets had enjoyed for years was gone. By mid-October 1976, 45 days after the deafening screech of the MiG-25 on the Hakodate tarmac, the work of the joint U.S.-Japanese technical team was complete. The once proud, formidable interceptor, the symbol of Soviet technological might, had been systematically reduced to 20 large, labeled crates of components, a grotesque testament to the thoroughness of Western intelligence gathering. The Japanese government formally announced the conclusion of its investigation into the illegal entry of the Soviet aircraft. They officially denied the Soviet request to return the plane fully assembled, citing the logistical impossibility of moving such a large, damaged aircraft across their territory and the need to preserve evidence. Instead, they offered the crated components for retrieval. The Soviet reaction was predictable and explosive. They refused to acknowledge the dismantling, demanding that the Japanese pay for the reassembly and return of the aircraft. Japan countered by presenting the Soviet Union with a staggering bill for the services rendered. Damage to Hakodate Airport, repairing the 2,000-meter section of runway and the safety overrun area damaged by the heavy MiG-25. Handling and storage fees, covering the cost of the large Japanese self-defense force contingent, the police cordon, and the secure storage of the highly sensitive components for over a month. Shipping, the cost associated with crating and transporting the 20 crates to a designated Soviet port. The total invoice presented to the Soviet government was estimated to be over 40 million Japanese yen, approximately $130,000 in 1976, a truly insulting demand for a nation that had just had its most valuable military asset dissected. After weeks of acrimonious diplomatic wrangling, Moscow swallowed its pride and reluctantly agreed to the conditions, though they refused to pay the Japanese repair bill. They dispatched a Soviet transport ship, the Taigonos, to the port of Hitachinoka, then known as Hitachiko, on the Japanese mainland. The vessel arrived under heavy scrutiny from the world media, its sole mission to recover the pieces of the shattered secret. The sight of the crates being loaded onto the Soviet ship was a powerful visual victory for the West. Each crate was marked with meticulous care, detailing its contents. Crate 1, nose cone and radar sections, thoroughly inspected. Crate 7, left engine core, bearings examined. Crate 12, ejection seat and oxygen system, documentation attached. It was a public acknowledgement that nothing about the aircraft remained secret. The return of the plane's components served multiple purposes for the Soviet Union. First, it ended the international diplomatic embarrassment. Second, it allowed their own engineers a final opportunity to assess what exactly the Americans and Japanese had learned. The Soviet technical teams accompanying the Taigonos quickly determined that the intelligence harvest was total. The Americans hadn't just looked, they had taken casts of turbine blades, X-rayed the radar waveguides, and mapped the circuitry of the R-40 missile guidance computer. The true depth of the penetration was devastatingly clear. This realization solidified the need for the immediate, fleet-wide modernization of the remaining MiG-25 interceptors, which was already underway. The cost was now exponentially higher, as the engineers had to assume the West knew every detail of the original design. Meanwhile, Viktor Belenko was settling into his new life in the United States. His debriefings continued for months, now focused less on the hardware and more on the human intelligence, the training procedures of the PVO, the structure of Soviet command and control, the morale of the elite Air Defense Corps, and the details of Soviet airbases in the Far East. Belenko, in exchange for his cooperation and the wealth of information he provided, was granted permanent political asylum and protection by the U.S. government. He was given a new identity and citizenship. The former senior lieutenant of the Soviet Air Force, who had once dreamed only of flying faster and higher for the motherland, was now a protected asset of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, living a life of freedom he could never have imagined in Chugyevka. The recovery of the crates marked the end of the public phase of the incident but the beginning of the quiet, technological revolution it triggered in the West. The Foxbat secrets were now integrated into NATO doctrine, helping to shape the next generation of Western fighter aircraft and missile technology, fundamentally altering the aerial balance of power in the Cold War. Following his swift, secret transfer from Japan, Viktor Belenko was immediately immersed in a new, intensely classified existence in the United States. His life transitioned from the rigid confines of the Soviet military to the vast, open-ended structure of the American intelligence apparatus. He became the single most important human asset the U.S. had acquired in years, effectively the living instruction manual for the Soviet PVO, Air Defense Forces. Belenko was relocated to an undisclosed facility, likely a secure military base, and began what would become months of intensive, continuous debriefing by experts from the CIA, DIA, and the USAF Foreign Technology Division, FTD. His information was far more valuable than the metal wreckage of the Foxbat, as he provided context, procedures, and the human element that no technical analysis could reveal. His debriefings covered several critical areas. Pilot training and morale. Belenko detailed the training standards, the high-stress environment, the intense political pressure, and the declining quality of life for elite Soviet military pilots. He confirmed that the propaganda about Soviet technological superiority did not match the reality of poor maintenance, short engine life, and frequent component failures. This provided key insights into the PVO's operational readiness. Air Defense Command and Control. He meticulously described the entire chain of command, the location and capabilities of Far East air bases, the radar coverage gaps he had exploited, and the exact protocols for identifying and engaging intruders. This information was instantly used by NATO planners to refine infiltration routes and electronic warfare strategies in Europe and Asia. Future systems. He provided intelligence on Soviet projects that were still on the drawing board, including details on the development of the MiG-25 successor, which would eventually become the MiG-31 Foxhound. This allowed the West to anticipate the next generation of Soviet threats years in advance. Belenko's cooperation was complete and unwavering. He had clearly made a profound and genuine ideological break with the Soviet system. In exchange, the U.S. government granted him full citizenship and a new identity, ensuring his protection from possible Soviet retaliation or assassination attempts, which intelligence agencies took very seriously. He was relocated to the American heartland, given employment as an aerospace consultant for military and intelligence organizations. His unique perspective, a high-ranking, technically proficient defector, was invaluable in developing countermeasures and understanding the Soviet mindset. His life, however, was not without peril. The KGB officially maintained that Belenko was a criminal and a traitor, and he was forced to live under a constant, if discreet, security umbrella. He had to sever all contact with his life in the Soviet Union, including his wife and young son, a painful and unavoidable consequence of his choice for freedom. The Soviet Union later publicly divorced him from his wife in absentia, ensuring his complete legal separation from the state he had abandoned. Years later, in 1980, Belenko made his first public appearance, granting interviews where he openly discussed his defection and his life in the Soviet Union. His testimony was a powerful piece of Cold War propaganda for the West. He spoke not of the grandeur of the MiG-25, but of the empty shelves in the Soviet stores, the poor quality of life, and the intellectual and political suffocation that drove him away. He revealed the internal jokes the pilots had about their own aircraft, that the Foxbat was powered by kerosene, the same as a tractor, and how its flight instruments were so primitive that a commercial passenger jet had better navigation gear. His accounts humanized the technical intelligence coup, transforming the incident from a simple security breach into a clear ideological victory for the West. The ultimate impact of his testimony was psychological. It was not just the plane that defected, it was an elite Soviet citizen who chose American freedom over the prestige of serving the Soviet military machine. This narrative resonated deeply with the American public and further embarrassed the leadership in Moscow, who could not refute the claims of a man who had lived within the highest ranks of their defense system. Belenko's willingness to expose the bureaucratic rot and technological shortcuts of the Soviet military provided intelligence that lasted for decades, helping to shape U.S. defense spending and strategic planning throughout the latter stages of the Cold War. He became the most expensive military acquisition in U.S. history and the quiet architect of a massive, forced Soviet modernization program. The defection of Viktor Belenko and the subsequent technical autopsy of the MiG-25 Foxbat marked a profound, yet quiet, turning point in the Cold War's technological arms race. The incident was a massive intelligence win for the West and an unparalleled humiliation for the Soviet Union, impacting strategic planning for years to come. The direct legacy of the Foxbat incident resonated most clearly in three major areas: technological countermeasures, strategic assessment, and Soviet policy. Technological countermeasures and development. The most immediate and critical result was the West's ability to completely dismantle the technological mystique surrounding the MiG-25. Before Belenko, NATO pilots flew under the assumption that the Foxbat was virtually invincible, a Mach 3.0 superfighter made of exotic materials. Belenko and the FDD analysis proved otherwise. Electronic warfare, EW. The discovery of the Smerch-A radar's operational frequencies and power output allowed the U.S. to rapidly develop highly effective, targeted electronic countermeasures, ECM. Western aircraft, previously vulnerable to the massive radar's burn-through capability, were soon equipped with sophisticated jamming pods specifically tailored to defeat the Foxbat. Fighter design. The insights gained influenced the ongoing development of the next generation of U.S. fighter jets. The intelligence debunked the need to chase the Foxbat's pure speed, instead validating the American focus on maneuverability, endurance, and advanced avionics. This reinforced the designs of the F-15 Eagle and the nascent F/A-18 Hornet programs, which emphasized situational awareness and all-weather capability over the brute force speed of the MiG. The knowledge that the MiG-25's high Mach numbers were unsustainable due to engine limitations and fuel consumption allowed Western planners to refine air combat tactics, knowing the Foxbat was only truly dangerous in short, high-altitude dashes. Strategic and psychological impact for the United States and its allies. The incident was a massive morale boost. It confirmed the superiority of the Western system, not just ideologically, through Belenko's defection, but technically. It provided irrefutable proof to Western defense departments that their strategic intelligence estimates of Soviet military hardware were, in some cases, wildly exaggerated. This helped rationalize defense spending, focusing it on genuine threats rather than hyped phantoms. For the Soviet Union, the incident triggered an unprecedented crisis of confidence. The KGB and GRU, Main Intelligence Directorate, immediately launched massive counterintelligence investigations, leading to purges and high-level dismissals within the PVO command structure. The public humiliation forced the Soviet government to undertake the costly, system-wide modification of its existing MiG-25 fleet, an expenditure that diverted critical resources from other military and civilian projects. Furthermore, the defection highlighted a profound weakness in Soviet security culture. The military was forced to assume that any aircraft or technology placed in the hands of its personnel could be lost to the West. This led to an even tighter grip of the political commissars over flight operations and increased technological compartmentalization, ironically reducing operational efficiency and trust within the ranks. The long shadow of the Foxbat, the MiG-25 that was returned to the Soviets in crates, was immediately and publicly declared obsolete by Moscow, a desperate attempt to minimize the intelligence loss. However, the jet's technology had been compromised, and the lessons learned were permanent. Viktor Belenko, the man who risked everything, lived out the rest of the Cold War as a free man, a permanent consultant and living symbol of the ideological conflict. His story, a man who traded the status of an elite Soviet pilot for the anonymity and freedom of an American citizen, was a potent narrative weapon until the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the end, the Foxbat was more than just a piece of technology. It was a physical artifact of the Cold War that landed not just on a Japanese runway, but right on the front page of international politics. It demonstrated that even the most heavily guarded secrets of a totalitarian state were vulnerable to the courage and desperation of a single individual seeking freedom. Belenko's crazy plan, once a source of laughter for KGB agents, ultimately cost the Soviet Union dearly, fundamentally shifting the balance of power in the skies and rewriting the operational manuals of the entire free world.